The piss test. Fake urine and real problems. The warehouse sat at the far edge of the industrial district, where the city slowly unraveled into shipping yards, truck depots, and endless concrete that hummed under the weight of commerce. At night, the building looked alive. Floodlights washed the loading docks in a sodium orange glow. Forklifts beeped endlessly in a chorus that never resolved. Semi-trucks rolled in and out every few minutes, their air brakes hissing like tired animals. Conveyor belts carried packages through the building like arteries pumping blood through a giant mechanical body. The place never truly slept. 300 employees on the books, 40 loading bays, millions of dollars of inventory moving every week. And yet half the warehouse floor sat empty. Not because business was bad. Business was exploding. Online orders had doubled in 2 years, then doubled again. Trucks lined up outside the gates at 4 a.m., waiting for bays to open. Drivers slept in their cabs. Dispatchers screamed into headsets. Somewhere on the East Coast, a customer was furiously refreshing a tracking page. And somewhere in this warehouse, the box they wanted was sitting on a pallet that nobody had time to unwrap. The problem wasn't demand. The problem wasn't capital. The problem wasn't equipment. The problem was staffing. Nobody could get hired. Inside the HR office on the second floor, Tanya Ruiz stared blankly at another failed lab report on her monitor. The fluorescent light above her desk had been flickering for 3 weeks. She'd put in a maintenance request, then another. Then she'd given up and started thinking of the flicker as a kind of company mascot, a small, stuttering metaphor for everything else. Failed, THC failed. Adulterated sample failed. Temperature out of range. She leaned back slowly in her chair. The chair groaned. Everything in this building groaned eventually. You've got to be kidding me. Across from her, Greg from recruiting looked up from a stack of applications he'd been working through since 7 a.m. He had the look of a man whose patience had been worn down to the consistency of wax paper. What happened now? Tanya turned the monitor toward him. Another temperature fail. Greg laughed tiredly, the kind of laugh you do when you're choosing between that and crying. That's what, 5 this week? 6. Damn. It's Tuesday, Greg. I know it's Tuesday. Tanya closed her eyes for a second. The flickering light above her pulsed softly through her eyelids like a heartbeat. The company had spent thousands running ads across the city. She had personally signed off on most of them. Now hiring, no experience needed, start immediately. Full benefits, $31 an hour starting pay. People flooded in every day. The waiting room downstairs was always packed by 9 a.m. Single moms in their best blouses, ex-servicemen in pressed jeans, college kids who dropped out, kids who hadn't, men in their 50s who'd been laid off from the steel plant when it closed. Tanya knew faces by now. She knew the regulars. She knew which ones had tried twice already. The interviews were easy. Most applicants passed. The job itself wasn't complicated. Move boxes, scan labels, operate pallet jacks, unload trucks, stack pallets. A person could learn 90% of the work in a single shift. The other 10% was knowing which supervisor to avoid on which day. And the benefits were almost unbelievable for warehouse work. Medical, with a deductible a human being could actually afford. Dental, vision, a 401k with a real match, 6%, vested after a year. Overtime pay at time and a half. 2 weeks paid vacation, 3 after 5 years. The company was desperate to keep people. They'd raised the starting wage 3 times in 18 months. The CFO had personally approved a referral bonus program that paid out $1,000 after 90 days of attendance. The break room had a vending machine with free granola bars. But corporate policy required identity verification, criminal background checks, urine drug testing. And the urine test was destroying everything. The warehouse had become infamous across the city. People had nicknamed it the Pee Factory. Tanya hated hearing it, especially because it was true. The hiring process had become a revolving door of failed tests, fake urine, nervous applicants, and absolute insanity. Some weeks they hired 2 people for every 15 interviews. Some weeks, 0. And the worst part? Most of the applicants weren't failing for hard drugs. It was weed. Mostly weed. Construction workers, college kids, single parents, former restaurant workers, military veterans with VA cards prescribing the exact thing they were getting fired for. People trying to rebuild their lives after layoffs. People trying to put a kid through community college. People who hadn't smoked since the weekend and couldn't believe their bodies were still holding on to it. Perfectly functional adults who simply couldn't pass the urine test. Meanwhile, the warehouse itself was falling apart from understaffing. Managers worked double shifts and slept on couches in the break room. Forklift operators skipped breaks and developed back problems they were too tired to complain about. Supervisors were unloading trucks themselves because there weren't enough workers, and 3 of them had thrown out their backs in the same month. Every week, corporate sent angry emails demanding faster hiring numbers. Every week, HR sent back the same answer: failed tests. At first, the cheating attempts were almost funny. People arrived carrying gallon jugs of water, like pilgrims approaching a shrine. The water jug applicants. Tanya had stopped commenting on them around month 3. They were too earnest. They thought they had a system. Applicants sat in the waiting room sweating through their shirts after drinking absurd amounts of fluids, trying to dilute their urine into something the lab couldn't read. One guy drank so much water, he nearly fainted during orientation. He hit the floor with the slow rolling collapse of a man whose blood sodium had given up the fight. Paramedics were called. He survived. He did not get the job. The clinic report came back: dilute specimen. Tanya had learned more about human urine in 6 months than she ever wanted to know for the rest of her life. Specific gravity, creatinine levels, temperature ranges, 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, anything outside meant the sample was suspect. The chemistry of pH balance and how nitrites tipped off the lab to certain adulterants. Things she never imagined would become part of her daily vocabulary, things she would never be able to unknow, things she had once mentioned at a dinner party and watched her sister-in-law set her wine glass down very, very carefully. Then came the home remedies. The internet was full of them: subreddits, YouTube tutorials, TikToks, where someone whispered the recipe over a stock photo of a kidney, vinegar, baking soda, activated charcoal, detox teas with names like liver reset and kidney surge, cranberry juice by the gallon, niacin pills until the skin flushed red. Applicants walked into the clinic smelling like chemicals and stomach acid. One woman admitted she'd spent 2 days drinking pickle juice because her cousin swore it scrubbed the kidneys. Another applicant arrived with urine so bright green, the lab technician thought the sample cup had melted. They sent it to a secondary lab. The secondary lab called back, baffled. Greg once whispered to Tanya, leaning over the divider between their desks, "At this point, I think these people are poisoning themselves harder than the drugs ever would." She didn't disagree. But the real madness started when people began bringing fake urine. That changed everything. At first, the clinic didn't realize what was happening. They just noticed strange results: samples that were too cold, too hot, chemically perfect, almost suspiciously perfect, the way a forged painting is too clean, oddly sterile, with no trace minerals at all, slightly off color, like someone had mixed yellow food dye into water and called it a day. Then the story started. One applicant dropped a small bottle out of his sweatpants while pulling out his ID. He froze. The bottle rolled across the linoleum and came to a stop at the receptionist's foot. The receptionist looked down. The applicant looked down. Neither of them spoke for what the receptionist later described as an eternity, but probably more like 4 seconds. He left without saying a word. Another walked into the clinic bathroom with hand warmers taped to his inner thighs, the kind hunters use, activated by air, designed to keep deer blinds warm in November. The clinic supervisor, a woman named Carla, who had worked in occupational health for 19 years, said she could smell the iron oxide from the doorway. One man had hidden synthetic urine inside a thermos labeled chicken soup. Another taped a pouch to his stomach under 3 layers of compression clothing in the middle of summer. He sweated through everything. By the time he reached the bathroom, the pouch had slid down to his waistband and the tubing had popped loose. He emerged from the stall 30 seconds later, walked past the lab tech without making eye contact, and went directly to his car. The clinic staff became paranoid. Everybody looked suspicious. People walked strangely, sweated nervously, adjusted their clothes constantly, tried not to clink. One applicant walked into the bathroom and came out 2 minutes later with urine somehow hotter than coffee. The technician stared at the cup, then at the temperature strip, then at the applicant. "Sir, this sample is 112 degrees. The man blinked. "Is that bad?" "Sir, that's a fever bordering on death." "Oh," a long pause. "Could you, write down that I'm sick?" The clinic staff laughed about that one for weeks. Carla had it printed on a coffee mug. The mug lived in the break room on a shelf above the sink, where new hires eventually noticed it and asked. And someone always told the story. And that's how legends survive. Then came the woman with the Bible. Nobody in HR ever forgot her. She looked completely normal, middle-aged, polite, professional, soft-spoken. She'd worn a cardigan to the interview and answered every question with the kind of measured warmth that made Tanya think, finally, an adult. Her name was Marlene. She had 2 grown kids. She'd been a hospital admin for 15 years before her department got outsourced. She wanted, in her words, something physical, something with my hands, something where I'm not staring at a spreadsheet that won't load. Tanya had nearly cried with relief. When security asked Marlene to empty her pockets before the test, she hesitated. That hesitation was enough. The security officer, a soft-spoken older man named Reggie, who'd worked at the warehouse for 9 years and had seen most of what a person can see, quietly asked her to also place her purse on the counter. Marlene's hand tightened on the strap. She set it down very carefully, like it was full of glass. Inside her purse was a hollowed-out Bible containing a 4-ounce bottle of synthetic urine, 2 feet of rubber tubing, the kind used for aquariums, 2 hand warmers, still in their wrappers, surgical tape, a small digital thermometer with a flexible probe, a folded printout of instructions, helpfully diagrammed. The clinic supervisor, Carla, just stared silently at the setup. Reggie stared too. Marlene stared at the floor. Finally, Carla asked, almost gently, "Did you build this yourself?" Marlene nodded proudly. "My nephew helped with the tubing." The entire HR office lost it when they heard the story. Greg laughed so hard he had tears in his eyes, gripping the edge of his desk. "She built a fake urine survival kit inside scripture," he kept saying, like he couldn't believe the universe had granted him this gift. "She built it inside the Bible, Tanya. Inside the Bible." Tanya laughed too, for about a minute. Then she stopped laughing, because Marlene had been one of the most qualified candidates of the month. Because Marlene had 2 kids in college. Because Marlene had spent her own money, what, $60? $80? On a kit she found on a sketchy website. And she had practiced with the tubing in her bathroom. And she had thought through the temperature problem and solved it. And she had walked into this building with the kind of preparation Tanya wished her own employees showed for actual job tasks. The funniest stories were usually hiding darker realities. Most applicants were desperate. Rent was rising. Food prices were insane. Daycare cost more than rent in some neighborhoods. Jobs were scarce, and the ones that weren't scarce paid $11 an hour and offered no benefits and scheduled you in 3-hour increments, 4 days a week, so you could never plan anything. People needed work. And this warehouse was one of the few employers paying enough for people to actually survive comfortably. $31 an hour for entry-level warehouse work was almost unheard of in the area. People talked about the job like it was winning the lottery. Cousins called cousins. Neighbors pulled neighbors aside at barbecues. You should apply, man. Just stop smoking for a few weeks and apply. And still applicants kept failing over marijuana. Meanwhile, half the management team drank heavily every weekend. The shift supervisor over receiving had been to 2 outpatient programs. The operations director was famously a vodka guy. The regional manager had been pulled over twice in his company SUV and quietly transferred each time. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. One afternoon, Tanya sat in on a management meeting where supervisors complained about staffing shortages. The conference room had a whiteboard nobody had cleaned in 3 months. A faded marker outline of a Q2 chart still boasted through the surface, mocking any attempt to draw a Q3 chart over it. "We're drowning out there," one manager said. He was in his late 40s and had the kind of permanent 5 o'clock shadow that came from working 16-hour days and giving up on the concept of grooming. "We're missing shipping targets every week." Another supervisor rubbed his eyes. "I had 2 forklift drivers quit this month. One went to drive for the soda distributor down the road. They don't drug test. They make $28 an hour. That's $3 less than us, Tanya." And he took the cut to leave. "Why?" someone asked. "Because his cousin failed a piss test here last month and told him not to bother." Then the operations director, a tall, soft-bellied man named Doug, who wore golf polos year-round, looked across the table at Tanya. "So what's the issue? Why can't HR fill positions?" Tanya opened her laptop. She had been waiting for this question for 9 months. She had a slide deck ready. She had numbers ready. She had somewhere deep in her chest a small fire that had been waiting for permission to burn. Because 70% of applicants fail the urine test. The room went quiet. 70? Someone repeated. Yes. For cocaine? No. Meth? No. The room already knew the answer. Mostly marijuana. One supervisor laughed bitterly. "You're telling me we can't unload trucks because people smoked weed on their day off?" Nobody answered him, because that was exactly what was happening. But corporate headquarters refused to budge. They believed strict policies reduced accidents and legal liability. They cited insurance memos from 1997. They cited a workplace safety study from a state that didn't share a border with this one. They cited the company's values. So the screening continued, and applicants became more creative. The internet had turned drug test cheating into an entire underground science. People came prepared. Synthetic urine brands with names like Quick Fix and Some Solution and Monkey Whiz sold at head shops, gas stations, and certain auto parts stores under the counter. Powdered urine kits, actual freeze-dried human urine, harvested from somewhere nobody asked questions about, that you reconstituted with water like instant soup. Detox drinks costing over $100, marketed in the same loud chrome bottles as energy drinks for men with names like Cody, heat strips, heat packs, heat belts, hidden tubing systems, prosthetic devices marketed for novelty purposes only, with reviews that said things like, "Passed my probation, 5 stars. One applicant wore 2 pairs of underwear with a hidden pocket sewn into the lining. The pocket was lined with thermal foil. He had clearly put thought into this. Another attached a tiny bottle to his calf with athletic tape. Someone else hid urine inside a shampoo bottle. He'd actually emptied a real bottle of Pantene and refilled it. He brought it in a clear plastic bag, like he was going through airport security." The lab tech asked why he had shampoo. He said he liked to wash his hands after the test. The lab tech, a man named Hector, who had genuinely seen everything, simply nodded and made a note. One applicant tried using animal urine. The lab caught it almost instantly. The technician reportedly stared at the results, then at the applicant, then at the results again, and finally said, "I'm pretty sure this came from a horse." The applicant, and this was the part Tanya could never get over, argued. "It came from me," he insisted. "Sir, the creatinine is wrong by an order of magnitude. I had a big lunch, sir. It was a big lunch." The clinic banned him from the property. He came back 2 weeks later under a different name. He was rejected again, this time for fraud. Then there was Leonard. Nobody ever forgot Leonard. Leonard looked like the perfect candidate. Clean background, strong work history. 8 years at a regional distribution company that had closed when its parent firm went under. Professional attitude. He showed up to the interview 10 minutes early, in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt that he had clearly ironed himself that morning. He aced the interview. Even Tanya liked him immediately. He shook hands firmly, made eye contact, answered every question perfectly. He talked about his kids, 2 girls, 8 and 11, without making it weird, just woven into the answers, the way real parents do. He talked about his last job ending with sadness but not bitterness. He talked about wanting to be on his feet again. Greg whispered afterward, "This guy's getting hired." Tanya nodded. Finally. Then Leonard went for the urine test. 10 minutes later, chaos erupted in the clinic hallway. A plastic bag, hidden inside Leonard's hoodie, had burst. It hadn't burst quietly. It hadn't burst discreetly. It had burst the way a water balloon bursts when a child throws it at a brick wall, loud, total, and committed. Human urine spilled down his clothes and onto the clinic floor in a rapidly expanding puddle that no one moved to contain because no one had a plan for this. The smell spread instantly. People began gagging. One receptionist actually ran outside, where she stood in the parking lot for a full 10 minutes with her hands on her knees, taking deep breaths. 2 other applicants in the waiting room got up and silently walked out the front door and never came back. Leonard stood frozen in absolute humiliation while urine dripped onto his shoes. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not flee. He simply stood there in a slowly spreading puddle, in his pressed khakis and his ironed button-down, with his head slightly bowed, as though he were taking a moment of silence. Nobody said anything. Finally, Leonard quietly asked, "Can I still apply again later?" The clinic supervisor nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Carla, who in 19 years had not lost composure once, had to walk into the back room and close the door. From the hallway, you could hear her shoulders shaking. Back at the warehouse, the incident became legendary. Employees referred to it only as the explosion. Months later, people still joked about it. "Don't pull a Leonard, man." It became a verb. You're about to Leonard yourself out of a paycheck. But Tanya stopped laughing after a while, because every ridiculous story pointed to the same reality. People were desperate enough to humiliate themselves for a warehouse job paying $31 an hour plus overtime. Leonard had 2 daughters. That bothered her more than the fake urine itself. It bothered her in a way she couldn't quite name. It sat in her chest at night when she was trying to sleep, this image of a grown man standing very still in a puddle of his own urine, asking with quiet dignity if he could try again. Then the accidents started. Not drug-related accidents, exhaustion accidents. The kind that happen when human beings are pushed past the line where their bodies can keep their attention sharp. The kind OSHA writes reports about and then files away. Overworked employees. Mandatory overtime that wasn't really mandatory, but was, in practice, mandatory. Burned out supervisors covering shifts they had no business covering. One forklift clipped a shelving unit after the driver worked 16 straight hours. The whole rack swayed. 3 pallets of boxed appliances came down in a slow-motion cascade that miraculously hit no one. A safety inspector arrived 2 days later. He took photos. He shook his head. He left. Another employee collapsed from heat exhaustion during a double shift in August. She was 46 years old. She had told her supervisor she felt dizzy. The supervisor had nodded sympathetically and asked her to please finish the bay. She did finish the bay. Then she sat down on a pallet and didn't get up. Paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. A receiving clerk fractured a wrist when a hand truck loaded too high tipped over. The clerk had been working alone because his partner had quit 2 weeks earlier and not been replaced. Orders shipped late constantly. Customers complained on social media. The brand team sent panicked emails. Executives panicked. Corporate finally sent 2 vice presidents to investigate. The executives arrived wearing expensive shoes, completely unsuited for warehouse floors. One of them was a man named Bradley. Tanya disliked him within 90 seconds of meeting him, which she felt slightly bad about, until he opened his mouth a second time and she stopped feeling bad. Tanya walked them through the operation. Half-empty stations, overworked crews, managers unloading trucks themselves. A forklift driver they passed who had visibly fallen asleep, standing up against a support column for about 3 seconds, and then snapped awake and continued working. One executive, not Bradley, the other one, a woman named Priya, who was watching everything carefully and saying very little, frowned. "Why are staffing levels this low?" Greg answered bluntly before Tanya could soften it. "Because nobody can pass the piss test." The executive blinked. "The urine screening." Bradley looked annoyed. "Well, obviously we can't hire drug users." Greg crossed his arms. He'd been at this company 11 years. He had a kid in middle school. He was not afraid of Bradley. "With respect, sir, we also can't run a warehouse without workers." That shut the room up. Priya wrote something in a small black notebook. Later that afternoon, they held a private meeting. Spreadsheets covered the conference table. The whiteboard had been wiped. Finally, in honor of corporate's visit. Turnover numbers, staffing shortages broken out by shift, department, and tenure. Overtime costs that had ballooned 340% year over year. Missed delivery penalties from 3 major retail clients. A line item simply labeled miscellaneous workers' comp that had quietly tripled. Then Tanya presented the hiring statistics. Applications received. Way up. Interviews completed. Way up. Background checks passed. Way up. Drug test failures. Way up. One executive, Priya, again stared at the numbers. 70% fail for THC? Yes. And these are mostly entry-level warehouse jobs? Yes. No driving? No machinery beyond pallet jacks for most of these? Mostly no. Priya leaned back slowly. She set her pen down. Outside the conference room window, Tanya could see half-empty loading docks. Truck after truck, waiting to unload. A driver was leaning out his cab window, arguing with a dispatcher. The dispatcher was holding a clipboard with both hands and looked like he was about to throw it. Finally, Greg said what everyone else was too afraid to say. "We're screening out half the workforce for a job people can learn in 8 hours." Silence. Bradley opened his mouth. Priya glanced at him. He closed it. Nobody argued, because everyone knew he was right. 3 months later, corporate changed the policy. The memo was 12 pages long and full of language about modernizing workforce health screening and evolving regulatory landscapes and competitive compensation strategy alignment. Tanya read it 3 times to find the actual change buried in the third-to-last paragraph. Marijuana would no longer automatically disqualify applicants for standard warehouse positions. Hard drugs still mattered. On-the-job impairment still mattered. Safety violations still mattered. Drivers and machine operators in safety-sensitive roles still got the full screen. But THC alone for warehouse floor positions no longer meant automatic rejection. The effect was immediate. Applications surged. Tanya had to bring in a temp just to handle the intake. The waiting room downstairs filled up by 8:30 in the a.m. instead of at 9. People who had given up months ago came back. People who had never bothered to apply because their sister had told them not to bother, they came in too. Hiring stabilized. The fake urine incidents disappeared almost overnight. No more hand warmers. No more exploding bags. No more suspiciously steaming samples. No more thermoses. No more Bibles. The clinic staff practically celebrated. Carla brought in a bundt cake. Hector brought in store-bought cookies. And somebody made a joke about checking them for adulterants. Everyone laughed. Then, everyone got quiet, because the laughter had a slightly hysterical edge, the kind that comes from people who have been holding something heavy for a long time, and have just been allowed to set it down. And something else surprised Tanya. Many of the previously rejected applicants turned out to be excellent employees, reliable, hardworking, consistent. Most of them didn't even smoke anymore by the time they were hired. They'd quit waiting for the policy to change, found out about the new rule, and just showed up. One became a shift lead within 6 months. He had the kind of natural authority you can't teach, and a way of de-escalating arguments between forklift drivers that the operations director described as frankly miraculous. Another, a woman in her 30s who'd failed twice in the old regime, trained new hires. She had a binder. The binder had tabs. The tabs were color-coded. New hires loved her. One man who had failed twice for THC, Tanya remembered him. A quiet guy in his 40s named Marcus, who had walked out of the clinic the second time without saying a word. Eventually, became warehouse safety coordinator. He was the one who pushed through the new fatigue management policy. He was the one who installed the heat stress protocols. He was the one who, when somebody collapsed on a hot August afternoon 2 years later, was on the floor in 90 seconds with water and a cold pack and a clear head. Tanya thought about Marcus a lot. The irony haunted her. For years, the company had nearly destroyed its own workforce over a screening policy that had little connection to actual job performance. They had turned away the man who would later save them from the very thing they were afraid of. Twice, because of a substance he used on his own time and that had nothing to do with his ability to think clearly under pressure. Meanwhile, the truly dangerous thing inside the warehouse had never been marijuana. It had been exhaustion, desperation, understaffing, burnout, a culture that asked overworked supervisors to push collapsing employees through one more hour. A policy that confused the appearance of safety with the substance of it. As Tanya walked the warehouse floor months later, finally seeing fully staffed loading bays again, she stopped near Bay 14. A truck was unloading. 4 people were on the bay. 2 were pulling pallets. 1 was scanning. 1 was directing the forklift. Nobody was sweating like they were about to faint. Nobody was on their second double in a row. Nobody was alone. She watched them for a few minutes. She thought about Marlene, who she'd never seen again. She hoped Marlene had found something. She had a feeling Marlene had. She thought about Leonard. Leonard weirdly had come back, 6 months after the policy change. Different shirt, same handshake. He had passed the test, gotten the job, and was now... Tanya checked her phone, because she sometimes pulled it up to remind herself that this was real. A senior pick-pack associate with a perfect attendance record and a bonus check coming at the end of the quarter. Tanya saw him sometimes in the hallway. They never spoke about that day. They didn't need to. The smile he gave her was a complete sentence. She thought about the woman who drunk pickle juice for 2 days. She thought about the guy with the 112-degree sample. She thought about all the people who'd never come back, who'd been told no and believed it, who were probably still out there somewhere, working $12 an hour shifts at gas stations and dollar stores and warehouses that paid less and screamed just as hard. She thought about how many of them could have been Marcus. How many of them were Marcus, somewhere else, unrecognized, holding up someone else's broken system. She thought about Bradley, who had been quietly reassigned. She thought about Priya, who had sent her a brief, dry email 2 weeks after the policy change that said only, "Good work, keep going." The fake urine had never really been the story. The story was how far ordinary people were willing to go just to survive. The story was a Bible hollowed out by a hospital admin who had 2 kids in college. The story was a man standing perfectly still in a puddle of his own urine, asking with the last shred of his dignity if he could try again. The story was a forklift driver who fell asleep standing up because the system had decided his coworker, perfectly capable, perfectly willing, wasn't allowed to help him. The story was that the company had spent years protecting itself from the wrong threat. Tanya watched Bay 14 for another minute. The fluorescent light above the dock was steady. Somebody had finally fixed it. Then she turned and walked back to the second floor, where her flickering office light still pulsed like a small, stuttering metaphor. And she sat down and she got back to work. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please follow the page. We're a new channel trying to reach more listeners like you, and your support truly helps us grow and continue sharing stories that matter. Don't forget to like and leave a comment. And if you have a story of your own you'd like to share, send it in. Our email is in the pinned comment and description below. The piss test, fake urine and real problems. The warehouse sat at the far edge of the industrial district, where the city slowly unraveled into shipping yards, truck depots, and endless concrete that hummed under the weight of commerce. At night, the building looked alive. Floodlights washed the loading docks in a sodium orange glow. Forklifts beeped endlessly in a chorus that never resolved. Semi-trucks rolled in and out every few minutes, their air brakes hissing like tired animals. Conveyor belts carried packages through the building like arteries